अस्सलाम वालेकुम एवरीवन। आई होप आप सब खैरियत से हैं। मेरा नाम हया फातिमा इकबाल है और मैं हाजिर हूँ फुलब्राइट वुमेन पॉडकास्ट की एक एपिसोड के साथ। मेरी गेस्ट आज हैं हफ्सा ख्वाजा। हफ्सा इज अ टीचिंग फेलो एट लम्स वेयर शी टीचेस पॉलिटिकल साइंस एंड साउथ एशियन स्टडीज। हफ्सा ने मास्टर्स किया है साउथ एशियन स्टडीज में कोलंबिया यूनिवर्सिटी से। और हफ्सा की बहुत सारी राइटिंग्स पब्लिश हुई हैं नेशनल और साउथ एशियन जितनी भी मेजर पब्लिकेशंस हैं। आई थिंक ऑल द नेम्स you'll see, you will find her name there. Hafsa, thank you so much for joining our conversation today. I'm really excited to be talking to you because when I spoke to you over the phone also मुझे बहुत मजा आया था आपसे बात करके, so I'm really excited about today.
Thank you for having me on this podcast.
हफ्सा, टेल मी, सबसे पहले आप मुझे ये बताएं कि एक अच्छे हिस्ट्री टीचर की या एक अच्छे हिस्ट्री प्रोफेसर की आपकी लाइफ में क्या अहमियत रही है?
I think my entire life, in some ways, has been shaped by the good history professors I had entirely. मैं अभी भी शायद उनको जब लिखती हूँ मैं ये कहती हूँ कि मैं I would be a different person going into their classes as an undergrad, and I would exit their classes as a new person. So their impact on my life has been immense. I think there's no way to measure it, but they've shaped me into the person that I am today. And I think it's because I had some incredible history professors, that even pushed me towards teaching history myself. And you're
हम्म।
completely like going into history with full commitment. So I think good history professors have had the most impact on my life.
और किस तरह से, मतलब उन्होंने ऐसा क्या किया क्लासरूम के अंदर कि आपको एक तो इंटरेस्ट भी डेवलप हो गया इस फील्ड में, फिर अब आप आप मास्टर्स भी करके आ गई और अब फिर आपको ये भी इंटरेस्ट हुआ कि इस सब्जेक्ट को और लोगों को पढ़ाया जाए। व्हाट मैजिक वर दे डूइंग इन द क्लासरूम?
खैर पाकिस्तान में जिस तरह हिस्ट्री पढ़ाई जाती है दिस अ वेरी टिपिकल वे राइट कि डेट्स पे एम्फेसिस है, नामों पे, फिगर्स पे, सर्टेन एपिसोड्स रट्टा लगाना है. It's a boring way of teaching history. But I think the professors that I had, specifically Dr. Ali Raza, Dr. Ali Usman Kasmi at LUMS, they taught history in a way which was more akin to storytelling in some
हम्म।
ways. Right? It had more to do with, history beyond dates in some way. And the fact that history is something which is, it is a heritage. And it is something that has a very big impact on the present also, not just in Pakistan, but around the world. So I think moving beyond those modes of studying history, beyond, अच्छा ये तारीख, ये बंदा, इसका नाम क्या था, that was very eye-opening. To seek, history, something that's not really just, it's not just a bunch of dates and whatnot, but there's so much more to it. There's so much more that it circulates around us too. So it was more about storytelling. It was more about, sort of a people's history too, I would say.
हम्म।
Which is कि
हम्म।
हमें ये तो पता है कि स्टेट पे क्या हो रहा था, what were the grander events, what not, but what were, for instance, the people, especially at the bottom, especially at the grassroots, how were they experiencing and seeing history? How are they writing it? And that was just, it was remarkable.
हम्म।
So I think seeing, there is a struggle of history, there is this contestation of the way the world could have been different, had different historical imaginations come about. That was, for me, it left an indelible impact on my mind. So they taught history in a way which I think typically in Pakistan उस तरह नहीं पढ़ाई जाती.
Why should we even bother about studying history? क्योंकि वो तो गुजर गई, मतलब तारीख तो हो गई, खत्म, मतलब खत्म नहीं हो गई लेकिन गुजर गई। तो हमें जरूरत ही क्या पड़ी है कि हम उसको पढ़ें और उससे कोई मीनिंग ड्रॉ करने की कोशिश करें?
I think ये बहुत अहम सवाल है, especially in Pakistan when it comes to Pakistan हिस्ट्री. मैं जो इसका जवाब देती हूँ वो अक्सर ये होता है कि पाकिस्तान में वी स्टडी अ हिस्ट्री दैट इज हिस्ट्री विद अ कैपिटल एच. It is a very authoritative account that is given to us by the state कि यही हिस्ट्री है, यही chronology है इसकी, and in some ways it also portrays history as something that was inevitable, right? कि बस यही होना था, यही पाकिस्तान की तारीख है, so on and so forth, this is all you need to know. But if you study history beyond that, and if you just generally study history also, you realize how rich it is. And also the fact in Pakistan ki history is not a thing of the past.
हम्म।
It is prevalent in the present in so many ways, either as a repetition or as a contrast or as, an inheritance that's being carried forward, or even as imaginations that didn't work out. So मैं तो अक्सर ये कहती हूँ कि critical histories or even reading history beyond what we know, that gives us the power to see कि history is made. It's not something कि ऊपर से आ रही है, yeah, it's there. There is a power, there are decisions that make history. And we are in many ways not just storytellers of history, but also agents and witnesses to it. And that thing, once you realize your role with relation to history, उसकी खुद ब खुद ही एक importance बन जाती है.
Can you give me an example of it? Or like an imagination
An
that did
example
not
of
work out?
there's so many. I think when it comes to, for instance, Pakistan, if we look at certain movements, for instance, the movement against Ayub, there were so many imaginations that different groups had in it. कि अच्छा Ayub के removal के बाद, what would the Pakistan look like that would come about? Right? More, I mean, there was Bhashani, they were, leftist students. कि Pakistan would be egalitarian, Pakistan would be, it would not have the feudal structure it has. Not just that, but I would even say कि Pakistan के बनने से पहले भी इस तरह की imaginations थी about Pakistan. Nilesh Bose, who's written about Purba Pakistan, he writes about how the Bengalis had a very beautiful conception of what Pakistan would look like. It would be a very equal state. It would be a counter against majoritarianism. All the things that later actually did happen in Pakistan. But in that case, it was a complete counter to all that they had in mind. But all kinds of imaginations, the struggle for a Pakistan that does not look like what it is right now. And that is a hope that not just us in this generation or in this day and age have, but people before us have always had to.
Right. So in some ways, like it also, like history can also like humble you down in a good way also, कि आप पहले नहीं है ऐसा ऐसा तसव्वुर करने वाले या कुछ अलग कुछ नया सोचने वाले, आपसे पहले भी
Absolutely.
हमारी ही उम्रों के लोग थे जो किसी और आइडियल के लिए या मे बी सिमिलर आइडियल के लिए काम कर रहे हो.
But there's also strength in that, right? Because if you realize that we're not the only ones who just सोच रहे हैं, you also realize there is an entire inheritance of imagination, of struggle that you can link yourself. And कि this is something that has happened in Pakistan, even if it's suppressed या ज़्यादा पढ़ाया नहीं जाता, but है तो हमारी history ना. ये रही हुई है, ये imagination, and the fact कि अभी भी ये imagination और hopes लोगों के हैं, gives it some kind of power, right? That it is something that so many people share.
Yeah, and almost like like I would be proud if I had an idea and then I found it कि यार ये तो हमसे बहुत पहले किसी और ने भी सोचा हुआ है, right? Like it almost gives you like this sense of camaraderie के oh my God,
Yeah.
we're part of a chain, right?
Yeah,
Of people who have been believing things and thinking about things. Um,
absolutely.
That's amazing. And do you like when you teach, हफ्सा, जब आप क्लासरूम में पढ़ाती हैं, ज़ाहिर है आपने अपने प्रोफेसर्स के बारे में बात की, आपके अंडर ग्रेड के प्रोफेसर्स का आपने नाम लिया, ऑब्वियसली फिर आप बाहर भी गई तो वहाँ पे भी बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग लोग आपको मिले होंगे पढ़ाने वाले. जब आप खुद क्लासरूम में पढ़ा रही होती हैं, can you assess, like can you figure it out when, like like कि जब आप कोई मिसाल दें और सामने वाले स्टूडेंट के जहन क्या बल्ब जो है वो कोई रोशन हो, like can you, like are you able to, like does that moment happen inside the classroom when like you can see the chamak in the eyes of the students कि उनको कोई बात समझ में आ गई है, कोई एक बड़ा कॉन्सेप्ट समझ में आ गया है या कोई नई नॉलेज मिल गई है, like how does that happen often in a history classroom, and what is the feeling like when you do see that?
I think it does happen in the classroom. What is interesting about teaching Pakistan studies, for instance, at LUMS, is कि it's taught in a very different way. एक तो undergrad है तो उसका level थोड़ा ऊपर होगा. One of the most interesting things is कि kids come into the class with a very particular perception कि अच्छा इस तरह पढ़ाई जाएगी. Pakistan studies हम हमेशा से पढ़ रहे हैं, बचपन से पढ़ रहे हैं. एक और ये अजाब फिर से पढ़नी पड़ रही है. शुरू में I think they really struggle कि अच्छा नहीं dates वगैरह पे emphasis उस तरह नहीं होगा and रट्टा नहीं चलने वाला.
Oh
You will
no,
actually have to engage.
oh.
And then they're like, oh, come this way. But I think a lot of them also then start genuinely engaging with the process कि अच्छा ठीक है. अगर अभी पूरा सेमेस्टर निकालना ही है तो what is she actually talking about at the end of the day? And it's a lot of them, initially, especially in the first half of the semester, there's a lot of confusion that they also encounter, because if you've studied a particular version of Pakistan's history, or most of your life, most of your schooling life at least, and suddenly you're being taught that in a different way, or you're being asked to question it, that is difficult, right? And I think what I've learned as an instructor also is that you have to come from a place of a lot of patience and humility. Because it is not easy to unlearn stuff, especially stuff that has to do with your history, your identity, things that are basically that give you a sense of who you are, give you a sense of what you belong. ऐसे subject तो नहीं है, economy and whatnot. These are things that are very personal too in some way. They're very social, they're very cultural. So you have to be really patient, and also a lot of them, I think initially मेरे semesters में, they would often react to stuff too. I had a kid in one of my classes who wrote initially he spoke up in class and he's like, आप Aisha Jalal पढ़ा रही हैं, and we were teaching about the bargaining counter thesis. An independent Pakistan might not have been Jinnah's original demand, right? And maybe he had a different strategy at hand. And he got really worked up and he said, I think Aisha Jalal hates Pakistan and I think she's against Pakistan, and why are you teaching this?
So maybe you also hate Pakistan.
Yeah, it was very rewarding though, at the end of the semester, the same student, I could see his thinking had evolved. And, he thought of what Jalal was writing, and he thought about different perspectives of history in a much more expansive way. That doesn't mean if she's questioning the narrative we know, does not mean she hates Pakistan. It's just that these narratives and these perspectives of history are also important. And they give us insights into things we might otherwise not know. So what happens is that कुछ ऐसी moments होती हैं, shocker होती हैं, especially when I tell kids कि, Sir Syed did not support 1857's revolt at all. So you can see the shock on their face. It never fails to, amuse me. But I think the more rewarding thing is throughout the semester, seeing how their thinking evolves. And that is very, very beautiful.
Right. And like it's almost like a gift of a skill that you give them and then they can apply it anywhere, like anytime in their lives, not just in a history classroom, not just about history.
Yeah.
That is amazing.
That is the hope.
Yeah. Don't we always hope our students do what we want them to do? In terms of you having to deal with really like this phenomena के students जो हैं मतलब undergraduate level के students आ रहे हैं और उन्होंने एक तरह की history पढ़ी हुई है और वो एक तरह से लिखी गई है. आपके ख्याल में पाकिस्तान में 12th grade तक जो सरकार की टेक्स्ट बुक्स हैं या इवन मतलब सरकार के साए तली लिखी हुई किताबें हैं, चाहे वो ए लेवल्स और ओ लेवल्स के सिस्टम की हों, किसी भी सिस्टम की हों, how much intentionality do you see in the way these books are written? ये क्योंकि I'm going to say something slightly controversial. I feel like जब आप हमारी मैथ की, फिजिक्स की कुछ टेक्स्ट बुक्स देखते हैं तो मतलब मैंने अगर सिंध बोर्ड से पढ़ा है फॉर एग्जांपल कराची में, तो उन किताबों को कभी देख के लगता है कि शायद इस किताब को लिख के ना मतलब पता नहीं कितनी बारी इसको शायद रीचेक किया गया कि इसमें एक्चुअली क्या लिख दिया गया. लाइक समटाइम्स लाइक मुझे याद है मेरे टाइम पे there were some math problems में digits ही गलत लिखे हुए थे, राइट, एंड the teacher had to say कि ये नंबर गलत है, आप पहले इसको चेंज करें तो फिर आंसर वो आएगा जो भी साइड में लिखा हुआ है. तो कभी कभी तो लगता है कि लिखने वाले मतलब लिख दी गई है लेकिन शायद किसी ने पलट के भी नहीं देखा है कि ये छप क्या गया है. ये जो आपकी फील्ड है, आपका जो सब्जेक्ट है, स्पेशली उसकी एप्लीकेशन लोअर लाइक मतलब जो ग्रेड्स हैं उसमें पाकिस्तान स्टडीज पे या सोशल स्टडीज पे आती है, आपको कितनी इंटेंशनैलिटी नजर आती है और आपको कितना लगता है कि तुक्के में ही बस ये किताबें लिखी गई हैं और जो चल रहा है वो चल रहा है? और डू यू थिंक एवरी ईयर सम पीपल सिट डाउन एंड सी व्हाट आर वी टीचिंग आवर किड्स एंड व्हाई दिस शुड बी टॉट एंड एक्स वाई जी शुड नॉट बी टॉट?
Yeah, so I was saying कि math वगैरह बड़े मुख्तलिफ सब्जेक्ट हैं, but when it comes to Pakistan studies or Pakistan की history वगैरह, there is a reason that they are made mandatory by the state. There is a very specific importance to it, because जब आप एक मुल्क की history या किसी nation की history पढ़ा रहे हैं, national history, that basically has to do with questions of who you are as a nation, why did your country emerge? What is your destiny? What is your purpose? What is your character? So those are very crucial questions linked to nation building. And when it comes to that, I think there is a reason that states all over the world try to exert some sort of control over the production of national history because it has a power to it, right? Okay, who has a place, for instance, in the nation? Who doesn't? Who qualifies to be a citizen and who doesn't? All of those questions are also quite they're very strongly also linked to governance and power and politics. So I do think that when it comes to Pakistan's national history and Pakistan studies specifically, there is a level of intentionality very much present within it. There is a dominant framework जो दे दिया जाता है कि अच्छा ये पाकिस्तान की हिस्ट्री है, टू नेशन theory, ideology of Pakistan, Urdu, so on and so forth. ये हमारे origins हैं, ठक ठक ठक. And that is a narrative जो काफी देर से चला आ रहा है. हल्का फुल्का शायद ट्वीक हो जाता है इधर उधर, बट मुझे लगता है ओवरऑल एज सच देयर इज नो इंटरेस्ट फॉर एटलीस्ट दोज हु हैव द पावर ओवर दिस टू चेंज दिस नैरेटिव.
राइट राइट राइट, हाँ. और मतलब हाँ, आप क्या चीज पढ़ रहे हैं, क्या चीज कम पढ़ रहे हैं, आप किसी जंग के बारे में 3 पेज पढ़ रहे हैं और किसी जंग के बारे में एक पैराग्राफ पढ़ रहे हैं, आई थिंक ये नहीं है. और मतलब मुझे ये होता है कि जब मैं 9th ग्रेड में थी तब मेरे ख्याल है, लाइक आई कैन स्पीक फॉर माई जनरेशन, कि हम थोड़े बेवकूफ ही थे उस तरह से, हम बहुत शायद कम गौर करते थे. बट अब तो टिकटॉक पे पॉलिटिसाइज होने वाली जनरेशन को तो सब समझ में आ जाता है देख के कि ये क्या है. व्हाई आर वी रीडिंग हाफ अ पेज अबाउट 1971 फॉर इंस्टेंस, जिस पे आपकी इतनी रिसर्च जो है वो चल रही है और पहले भी रही है, राइट? सो लाइक अब तो मतलब एवरीवन इज पॉलिटिसाइज्ड, एंड आई मीन लाइक इट्स अ गुड थिंग टू बी पॉलिटिसाइज्ड, टू बी पॉलिटिकल इन थिंकिंग एंड ट्राइंग टू सी द वर्ल्ड. तो इट्स फैसिनेटिंग वाकई में. आई वांट टू नो हफ्सा कि आपने ऑब्वियसली हिस्ट्री अपने अंडरग्रेड में भी पढ़ी और फिर आपने अपने मास्टर्स में भी हिस्ट्री पढ़ी, और ऑब्वियसली आपने विटनेस किया लोगों को हिस्ट्री पढ़ाते हुए भी एट बोथ लेवल्स. बट आई थिंक मोर देन द लेवल्स, आई वुड लव टू नो if there were any differences in the way um, South Asian history was being taught in Pakistan versus how South Asian history was being taught at Columbia, New York, in America.
I think in Pakistan, I had the very big benefit of having some phenomenal history professors. And they also taught, tying back to your initial question, how did they teach history, which left such a big impact on me? They taught history in a way which made me realize, history is not a thing of the past, especially in Pakistan. It's very much a thing of the present. And there is a relevance, there is a resonance to what we're studying to our context as Pakistanis too, right? And so whatever text we read, whatever knowledge we gained, it would always be linked to what was happening around us in the moment. Which is what made me realize that history is something that is very powerful and it's very, very important too. In Colombia, I would say, of course, some of the best professors were teaching history over there, but मुझे जो हमेशा एक चीज खटकती थी वो ये थी कि you're teaching South Asia in a way where there is this disconnect between South Asian history and South Asian presence.
South
So
Asian
अगर आप
presence, you're saying? Sorry.
Yeah, South Asian presence. कि for instance, South Asia मुझे हल्का सा ये लगता था कि South Asia in Colombia is sort of taught in some ways just as a relic, right? As if it has a connection to the present. We know that South Asia, particularly India or Pakistan, history is weaponized and used in so many contexts in the contemporary moment. Not just in India and Pakistan, even in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, history lives, right? तो मुझे हमेशा ये होता था कि आप पढ़ा तो रहे हो, but what is the link to what you're teaching to what's actually happening in that region, which is not a thing of the past. It's a region with like millions of people. It has some very dynamic, convoluted politics also. So मुझे वो disjuncture or disconnect हमेशा थोड़ा सा it would bring me a lack of comfort at times. It would discomfort.
And are there like specific I mean, because एक तो academia में वो बहुत होता है ना कि academia में different sub sections of people बहुत होते हैं, चाहे वो कोई भी field हो, right? Not just history, any discipline. is there like a clear I mean, I realize it's an oversimplified question, but really that's how oversimplified my thinking about it is right now. Okay, is there like a clear bifurcation among um academics who teach history between the ones
Hmm.
who are like the activist types and the ones who are like the scholar types?
I think there is.
Uh-huh.
I think there is. I think there's a very clear distinction कि मेरा मसला हमेशा ये रहा है कि if you're a historian, your role is not that of a mortician or embalmer कि you're just digging up history and presenting it, right? There is so much more to it. And I personally feel like all knowledge production is political.
Hmm.
People take political to be, कि partisan politics, कि you support, Pakistani political parties or American political parties. I think we need to expand our definition of what political is.
Mm-hmm.
Political is anything that has to do with values, with ideas. Anything that has any kind of idea inherent in it is political. And a lot of people tend to say, no, I have no politics, I have no ideology. Just because your ideology is mainstream does not mean you don't have ideology,
Hmm.
right? Just accepted by the mainstream. So history writing and history teaching is also a political and ethical endeavor.
Hmm.
It's not something that's apolitical. It's not something that's happening in just the vacuum. ऐसा तो नहीं है.
Hmm.
There are ethical claims within it. कि अच्छा, if you're teaching this history, what for? Why should you care?
Hmm.
What can you do as agents of history right now?
Hmm.
And I think there is a very clear demarcation between historians who see themselves as having those political and ethical claims and see that there is a value to history in that, when those who just feel like, history हो गई, मेरा काम सिर्फ पढ़ाना है उसको
Oh,
कि
oh.
हाँ, अच्छा ये हुआ, इस सन में ये हुआ, इसमें ये हुआ, इस शख्स का ये नाम था, and that's it.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
they claim and they sort of they narrate the position that they've taken as simply being, our role is simply that of a scholar,
Hmm.
an academic. Our role is not that of an activist or a practitioner. Our role doesn't have to do with policy. But it's easy to say that. I think in the real world, if you have that position, you have a certain responsibility too. And
Hmm.
I think those conversations are exactly the sort we've been seeing, especially on social media, with regards to a lot of celebrity academics and celebrity scholars and their positions
Hmm.
right now with what's happening in Palestine.
Right.
I think that's a very ongoing conversation
It's a
too.
yeah.
What is your role at the end of
Right, 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 right. And how you like on a personal level, like how are you uh I think like what's your I mean it's such a again like a very like an oversimplified question, but what's your take on like celebrity historians or history being taught through Instagram or TikTok in quick, like
the day?
palatable pieces? Like, what's your take on it? Like, has it evolved over time? Does it make you easy, uneasy? Because it's your subject. So sometimes you're a bit like
Yeah.
protective about our subject, also, right?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. For me, it's a mixed bag. I think in some ways the accessibility of history that's being provided by these platforms is very, very important. It also evokes more interest in history that is otherwise not present. But I also feel like जब आप एक TikTokization है, of this bite-sized version of history, there is always a risk to it also कि maybe you're simplifying it. Like I know recently there was this a lot of critique on this version of girly pop, girly boss, history versions, explain the Israel-Palestine conflict in the girly pop term or whatever. There is always a risk of oversimplifying stuff, or also just being, casual about something that otherwise is literally has actual lives at stake. So I like the fact that TikTok pay, Instagram pay, there are so many people trying to make history accessible. They also narrate it in a very amusing, entertaining
Yeah,
way. And I think that's important for people to easily access. You're just scrolling, you also develop more interest. But there's always a risk that maybe, you're oversimplifying it, or there are certain things within it that might actually not even be accurate.
right,
So
right,
for
right.
me, it's a mixed bag. I think it's important for even historians of this day and age to sort of utilize and engage with those
Hmm.
platforms.
Hmm.
So don't cede space entirely, because there is this risk, oversimplification हो रही है, या it's being very casually narrated, yet there's some things are very inaccurate within it. But I think it's important for us to also make history accessible. So
Right.
maybe the way to manage that mixed bag is for historians to also engage with these platforms in simpler language, in topics that interest people and whatnot.
Right, right. Because at some point, I think historians are also not doing that. Like, not a lot of historians are doing that, right? Like, a
Yeah.
lot of history is
Yeah.
still like, unless you find interesting teachers at like at a university, um, मतलब a lot of, I guess, I mean, obviously, if you're an academic, आप एक खास तरह से लिखते हैं, आप नुआंस डालते हैं, आप सिटेशंस भी डालते हैं, आप सब कुछ करते हैं, बट समटाइम्स लाइक
Yeah.
जो टेक्स्ट होता है वो भी काफी इनएक्सेसिबल होता है कि आप 6 बार पढ़ते रह जाते हैं
हाँ,
उसको, आपको फिर आपको अपनी अकल पे शक होता है कि शायद मैं बेवकूफ हूँ, मेरी समझ में नहीं आ रही है बात, दिस
yeah, I
सेंटेंस
mean,
दैट्स
but
कंटिन्यूइंग फॉर
that
14
is true.
लाइंस लाइक
It's true. For instance, मुझे अभी तक याद है, my undergrad, we had to read Spivak's, Can the Subaltern Speak? And I read it like 10 times, thinking,
हाँ.
yeah, I don't know if the subaltern can speak, but I certainly can't read. I don't read. I have no idea who is this written for. And that's true, which is why मेरी थोड़ी ये gripe है with, I think, generally academics के, ठीक है, your profession, your field is to write in a particular way. You're trained to write in a particular way for a particular audience, with certain methodologies, but there should be this sense of थोड़ी बहुत obligation कि just how do you publicly disseminate that knowledge? And I think that's a conversation that I got familiar with also with the rise of Trump in America, which is that a lot of people were saying that if you have issues with people just consuming disinformation, misinformation, and false narratives of history and whatnot, then you need the experts to also step in, right? Rather than just ceding that space where such narratives can take hold. You kind of have to step down from your ivory tower and also speak in a language that people will find easy to understand, will find easy to engage in, and will also not find that you're condescending or that you think lesser of them.
right,
So
right,
there
right.
is this lack of public engagement and public dissemination of the knowledge that you're producing, which I feel like is very, very crucial.
क्या आप मतलब शिकवा भी कर रहे हैं कि लोगों को नहीं पता है, लेकिन फिर इनवर्ड लुकिंग भी
आप
थोड़ी कम
बता
हो
भी
रही
नहीं
है
रहे।
कि बता भी नहीं रहे, फिर जगह भी आपने छोड़ी हुई है उन लोगों के लिए जो आपको पसंद नहीं है,
Yeah,
फिर आई मीन देयर नीड्स टू बी समथिंग सेड अबाउट कि अच्छा सही है, आपको अगर कोई पसंद नहीं है तो क्या आप उससे एंगेज नहीं करेंगे, या मतलब एंगेज करें या आप उनको काउंटर भी करें, मतलब बेशक करें,
yeah.
लेकिन कुछ तो करें मतलब
मतलब डायलॉग करें, अब भाई हजार और चीजें हो सकती हैं, यू कैन राइट आर्टिकल्स,
राइट.
आप उर्दू अखबार में लिखें, आप इंग्लिश में लिख लें, आप टीचिंग्स कर लें, स्टडी सर्कल्स कर लें, हजार और चीजें होती हैं जो जर्नल आर्टिकल के अलावा भी आप कर सकते हैं,
राइट.
नॉट आई एम नॉट सेइंग either or, but you can also write a journal article and also engage in a public dissemination of the knowledge you're producing.
राइट, राइट. और हफ्सा भी थोड़ी देर पहले आप बता रही थी कि आपने एक ये कंपैरिजन तो हमें दिया कि साउथ एशियन स्टडीज कोलंबिया में कैसे पढ़ाई जा रही थी और पाकिस्तान में किस तरह आपको पढ़ाई गई, और आपने थोड़ा, आई मीन, आई लव योर ऑनेस्टी दैट यू सेड दैट इन न्यूयॉर्क इट वाज बीइंग टॉट, it made you sometimes feel like South Asian history was a like a relic, कोई artifact है, एक चीज है जिसको हम पढ़ रहे हैं, जो कि आई थिंक पढ़ाने के अंदाज से भी कनेक्टेड है, शायद इस बात से भी कनेक्टेड हो कि आप फासले में ही दूर हैं एक जगह से, तो आपको वो थोड़ा सा
हाँ,
रेलिक लगता भी है क्योंकि आप जी नहीं रहे ना उस
हाँ,
रियलिटी को, रोजाना आप देख नहीं रहे कि किसी चीज के क्या रेपरकशंस हैं जो अभी तक चल रहे हैं या
yeah,
एक नई साइकिल रिपीट हो रही है, बट आपने साथ में ये भी कहा कि आपने कुछ जो डिसिप्लिन की जो एक टेक्निकल स्किल्स होती हैं आपने वो भी सीखी. आई एम रियली इंटरेस्टेड टू हेयर मोर अबाउट दैट, इस वजह से भी कि हो सकता है कि आपकी बात इस वक्त कोई ऐसे लोग सुन रहे हों जो कि अभी अपने अंडर ग्रेड में भी ना आए हों, वो शायद अभी अपने हाई स्कूल अपने इंटरमीडिएट वाली लाइफ में हों, और उनको आपकी हिस्ट्री के हालात वाकयात वाली जो उसकी स्टोरी टेलिंग वाला पार्ट है उससे तो इंटरेस्ट हो रहा हो, लेकिन शायद उनको अगर आप एक अंदाजा दे सकें कि टेक्निकली किस किस तरह की
हाँ,
स्किल्स चाहिए होती हैं, बिकॉज है तो ये हिस्ट्री, एंड हिस्ट्री इज मतलब जहां तक ले जाओ
yeah,
उसको जितनी सदियां पीछे, तो इट्स लाइक यू डीलिंग विद मतलब centuries like worth of
yeah,
like material. हाँ,
yeah.
क्या टेक्निक्स चाहिए होती हैं, किस तरह की स्किल्स चाहिए होती हैं टू टू बी एबल टू बिकम लाइक अ गुड हिस्टोरियन, अ स्किल्ड हिस्टोरियन.
आई थिंक पहली चीज जो सबको समझने की जरूरत होती है वो ये भी है कि हिस्ट्री इज अ डिसिप्लिन.
राइट.
It's not just that you're excavating something from the ground. In that way, history and archaeology are different, right? It is a discipline, which means that there it has a particular methodology. It has a particular way of proceeding. It has a way of understanding where the knowledge is coming from, deciphering it, reading, writing, all of that. So ये जो एक सोच आई थिंक पाकिस्तान में अक्सर पाई जाती है कि हिस्ट्री कोई भी लिख सकता है. You just need to find the right person. कि अच्छा मुझे ये पता था मैंने इसकी हिस्ट्री लिख ली. नहीं, a historian is somebody who's very rigorously trained also. अच्छा, what qualifies as a source that has legibility? What is not something that, what is something that has a weak claim to legitimacy, or what is, a weak source? All of those things are taught, which is why अक्सर जब मैं क्लास में बताती हूँ कि if you're reading somebody's work, it's not just a book that they produce themselves. It's gone through the rigor, right? It's been reviewed by people. It's been fact checked. It's the reason you have it in your hand is through a lot of process, a lot of rigor. There are citations you have to substantiate every claim with. There is so much more that you have to do. So it is a discipline, it has a training, it has a methodology, it has a set of tools that you need to be keeping in check. It has standards. So लिख तो किताब सब हिस्ट्री पे देते हैं, but historians, I mean, it is a professionally trained position, right? It's not everybody is one. And I think Pakistan में especially ये मसला है कि you will find plenty of books on history written by people who, for instance, is a doctor or an engineer. Nothing against them. But you also would not expect a professionally trained historian to maybe write something on medicine, right? Field ka to be a historian, I feel like, first of all, of course, you need that understanding that it's a discipline, it's a field that has a lot of training. Secondly, the fact that at the end of the day, you have to be trained. You have to be good at reading, you have to be good at writing, you have to be archival work. I mean, that is a lot. Which is, especially in a place like Pakistan, जहाँ archive की तो कोई इज्जत ही नहीं है. मतलब, I know that there are places, for instance, where the archival documents are rotting. There is no caretaking that's being done of them. There is a lot of gatekeeping of archives in Pakistan also. आप क्यों आए हैं? क्यों आपको ये डॉक्यूमेंट चाहिए? आप ये इनका रेफरेंस हैं, क्या फायदा? ये आपको पकड़ के आप क्या कर लेंगी? क्या लिख लेंगी? तो आर्काइव में जाना भी, and even reading the documents over there is not even just a simple process of just entering and reading a page. You have to contextualize it, you have to substantiate it by other things. So there's an entire process. And I mean, as rigorous as it sounds, I think it's also very rewarding.
मुझे ये बताएं कि एक आर्काइवल डॉक्यूमेंट को, मतलब मैं तो अगर पढ़ूं तो मैं तो वाकई में सिर्फ आई वुड जस्ट रीड थ्रू इट. आई वुड प्रॉब्ली पे मोस्ट अटेंशन टू द फॉन्ट. लाइक दैट्स द काइंड ऑफ पर्सन आई एम. लाइक द विजुअल पर्सन के, ओ माय गॉड, इज इट हैंड रिटन, इज इट कैलीग्राफी, लाइक व्हाट्स हैपनिंग, राइट? बट that just shows how I would have never excelled in history if I had gone into it. But tell me, how would you, अगर आपके हाथ कोई इंटरेस्टिंग, इम्पोर्टेंट, अनइम्पोर्टेंट, एनी हिस्टोर एक आर्काइवल डॉक्यूमेंट हाथ लगे, बस एक पेज का है, तो आप, like, can you take us through like the basic steps of how you would look at it as someone who's a history, like who studied history?
I think one of the things I would do is the reading of every document might also differ, but a more standard answer would be, when you're reading, for instance, a document, you have to pay attention to the little details too, right? अच्छा कोई नाम अगर लिखा हो उसके अंदर, कोई date लिखी हो, you have to circle those out, right? कि why are these things important? कि कौन है जिसका जिक्र किया जा रहा है? If any, there's the narration of an episode, जो भी, you also try to see, can this be corroborated by other sources? And even more than that, who has written this document? क्या position थी उनकी society में? What were they doing? What was their point of writing this document? For instance, I mean, a lot of court chroniclers and court historians, they would write history in a very particular way because they also wanted to please the court that they were being patronized by. So to expect a very neutral history from their end about the court that they were writing about, you have to be cautious about it. You can't take their word, right? Because their livelihood is dependent on that. So who's writing it? Why are they writing it? What was their position in society? क्या उन चीजों का जिक्र है इस डॉक्यूमेंट में, आर दे corroborated by other documents, where else can we find mentions of those? Even besides that, I think one of the questions that my professors also taught me was कि what are the silences in this document too?
Hmm.
whose story is missing, या whose perspective is missing, या अगर किसी का जिक्र किया जा रहा है किस तरह किया जा रहा है.
Right.
Is it fleetingly? Is it something that's they're being described in a negative way, in a positive way? So I mean, document besides एक page एक हो सकता है, but you can go on and on about actually trying to interpret and study it.
Beautiful. And but I believe, like, I mean, like, अगर आपको आपके हाथ लगते होंगे कोई भी आर्काइव्स, तो मेरे ख्याल है आप तो बस काफी ज्यादा एक्साइटमेंट होती होगी मेरे हाल में, right? कि it's like this treasure trove of things that you've bumped into ना.
It absolutely it is. I think with me, because most of my grad school was in COVID. The benefit that I had was that a lot of the archives I could access, or archival documents I was able to access, were digitized.
हम्म.
So
क्योंकि आप
मुझे
अमेरिका में
फिजिकली
भी थी.
मुझे ऐसा कोई मौका नहीं मिला फिजिकली आर्काइव्स में उस तरह जाने का. उस वक्त अक्सर लाइब्रेरीज वगैरह बंद भी थी.
राइट.
But I had the benefit that a lot of the documents, especially colonial documents that I was trying to look at, they were already digitized.
हम्म.
Um, and so you would be sitting in at home or in a library and just being able to see it on your screen. But the process was the same nonetheless.
और आ, पाकिस्तान में जनरली आपको या आपके साथी जो है या पीपल हु हैव बीन सीनियर टू यू, हैज इट over time has it become more difficult to access archives related to Pakistan inside Pakistan, or do you see some concerted, non-concerted efforts जिसके जरिए आर्काइव्स कुछ ना कुछ अवेलेबल हो रहे हैं लोगों के लिए, whether they're hard copies, whether it's digitized, either way?
I think it's in that case also it's sort of a mixed bag, right? A lot of the professors that I still talk to who are working in Pakistan, they say कि नहीं, अभी भी आर्काइव में अगर आपने फॉर इंस्टेंस पाकिस्तान की कैबिनेट की फाइल्स आपको पुरानी एक्सेस करनी है,
Hmm.
you can't just walk in and access those. You need somebody inside who can vouch for you, who can give you access, who you need, who's your reference.
Hmm.
And वहाँ जाकर भी, I recently was talking to Dr. Kasmi, and he was telling me that a lot of documents are also now increasingly censored. They're redacted. So document to hoga, but all the actual parts of it that you're looking at, they will be either censored or redacted.
Hmm.
So those kinds of issues also, right? Other obviously there are efforts saying कि ये तो पाकिस्तान में वैसे archives का हाल है. There's also the suspicion I feel like Pakistan में wherever you're trying to access a document, it's like why do you want to access it?
क्या जरूरत पड़ी है
क्यों
आपको 50 साल बाद? हाँ.
क्यों आप क्या करना चाह रहे हैं? एक तो वो सस्पिशन फॉर नो रीजन, इफ इवन इफ यू जस्ट ट्राइंग टू स्टडी इट और राइट हिस्ट्री, एक तो सस्पिशन से डील करो, देन द इश्यूज ऑफ एक्सेसिबिलिटी, देन देयर आर आल्सो इश्यूज आई वुड से ऑफ प्रिजर्वेशन. वो चीजें बिल्कुल ही डॉक्यूमेंट या अगर थी भी तो वो भाई डॉक्यूमेंट्स फेंक दिए गए, किसी ब्यूरोक्रेट ने कहा भाई तो रद्दी में करवा दें. All of those issues, right? Because there's no system, there's no importance to keeping a system of it too. But then there are efforts by, for instance, a lot of professors in different universities in Pakistan who've collaborated with international universities. Okay, let's get together and digitize certain documents and make them accessible. For instance, अगर ब्रिटेन में पढ़े हुए documents या यूके में हैं तो आप डिजिटाइज करें ताकि जो यहाँ स्टूडेंट्स हैं पाकिस्तान में they're able to access it too. I think recent years में partition पे जो documents कुछ थे, they've been digitized. Documentation with regards to, I think, the soldiers who participated in World War I and World War II, that has been digitized. So those are slow efforts because obviously digitization takes a lot of time, takes a lot of resources too, I presume. But in Pakistan, of course, I mean, it's not the easiest thing to, even if you land into an archive. I had a friend who's doing his PhD at Brown, and he's also in history. He spent the entire summer trying to access archives in Lahore. He's like, even dates का पता नहीं होता कि किधर क्या चीज पड़ी हुई है, आज होती है कल नहीं होती, कल होगी तो भाई अब आपको रेफरेंस की जरूरत है इसको एक्सेस करने के लिए. It's unnecessarily difficult.
Right, right. And it is difficult for a reason, right? I mean,
Yeah,
ये इसमें भी टेक्स्ट बुक्स वाली इंटेंशनैलिटी तो है. मुझे तो ये लगती है.
absolutely.
I mean, as a documentary filmmaker, whenever you go out to try to get archives like news archives from Pakistan, मतलब पीटीवी के खबरों के
Yeah.
archives हो, पीटीवी के वो हो पुराने, मतलब कोई पार्लियामेंट प्रोसीडिंग्स के archives हो, मतलब हर चीज रिकॉर्ड तो होती है, जबरदस्त होती है, एट द एक्सपेंस ऑफ
हाँ
ऑल अदर मटेरियल्स होती है कि ब्रॉडकास्ट हो रहा है, पार्लियामेंट का सेशन तो हो ही जा रहा है, राइट? लेकिन
या
उसकी आर्काइविंग तो यानी मुझे ये भी लगता है ना कि जब तक हम आर्काइव्स की सियासत का खुद हमें फ्लेवर हम नहीं चखते, तो कभी कभी हमें ये लगता है कि शायद प्रिजर्वेशन का ही मामला है सिर्फ, कि कागज चूहा खा
हाँ
गया, फिल्म रोल जो है वो दीमक खा गई। लेकिन सिर्फ चूहा और दीमक इज नॉट टू बी ब्लेम्ड, like
एग्जैक्ट
there are people whose job is to make sure you don't get what you're looking for.
लिटरल गेट कीपर्स.
हाँ, लिटरल गेटकीपर्स, और आ, हाँ, और मतलब ऐसा क्या सेंस ऑफ बीइंग थ्रेटेंड है कि आप ये किए जा रहे हैं, और हर सूबे में ये होता है, फेडरल के लेवल पे भी होता है, मतलब जहां जाएं होता है, और बात हमेशा ऐसी होती है कि वो वेयर हाउस में पानी भर गया था तो इसलिए वो फिल्में खराब हो गई, बट पानी वानी मतलब पानी पानी भरा हुआ हो तो उस रील को भी ठीक करने का ग्लोबली कुछ ना कुछ तरीके हैं।
हाँ
मतलब ये घर
हाँ
की फोटो थोड़ी है कि भाई बारिश का पानी आया है तो तस्वीरें बह गई, मतलब ये तो
हाँ
एक रियासत की प्रॉपर्टी है, मतलब दुनिया में उन रील्स को ठीक करने वाले लोग भी हैं, लेकिन वो क्यों नहीं होती ठीक, वो ठीक क्यों नहीं
हाँ.
की जाती? और सारे ड्रामे तो मौजूद है पीटीवी के पुराने, लेकिन न्यूज आर्काइव नहीं है, तो क्यों नहीं है? राइट, मतलब
राइट. एंड
एंटरटेन।
ये
हाँ,
सवाल वाकई ये पूछना, आप जब ये इश्यूज एनकाउंटर करते हैं, ये नेचुरली सवाल आ जाता है कि भाई
राइट,
क्यों.
या
एक आई मीन देयर इज ओनली टू अ पर्टिकुलर पॉइंट दैट यू कैन से कि अच्छा इनको इंटरेस्टिंग नहीं आर्काइव करने में, बट आर्काइव्स हैं.
हाँ है, एंड आई थिंक
लेकिन
देयर इज एन इंटरेस्ट टू नॉट प्रिजर्व देम।
एब्सोल्युटली दे मेजर लैक ऑफ इंटरेस्ट शायद किसी चीज में, बट देयर इज एन इंटरेस्ट इन आल्सो नॉट लेटिंग पीपल एक्सेस इट.
अभी आपने ये भी बताया हफ्सा कि आपका अम, अ, एक तो आपने हमें एक ये आप इस जर्नी पे लेके गए भी, एक आर्काइव को कैसे पढ़ सकते हैं। मुझे आप ये भी बताएं कि अ, अगर हम एक हिस्ट्री की कोई छोटी सी पतली सी बुक पढ़ रहे हो, कोई कोई पूरा डॉक्यूमेंट पढ़ रहे हो, कोई पूरी किताब पढ़ रहे हो, हम कैसे अंदाजा लगा सकते हैं? अब ऑब्वियसली अब हम हिस्ट्री हमारा डिसिप्लिन नहीं है, हमारी वो वाली ट्रेनिंग कभी भी नहीं हो सकती जो आपकी है, हम शायद वो उतना ट्रेन होना भी नहीं चाह रहे, राइट? बट जब हम कोई किताब उठाते हैं जो हिस्ट्री से रिलेटेड हो, वो कौन सी बेसिक चीजें हैं जिसके जरिए हम बेशक पूरी किताब पढ़ें एंड तक, बट वो कौन सी चीजें हैं
हाँ
जिसकी बुनियाद पे हम ये फिगर आउट कर सकते हैं कि ये किताब कितनी एक्यूरेट है, या इसमें ये सच है या सच और थोड़ी
हम्म
अफवाह का मिक्सचर है? हाउ डू वी फिगर दैट आउट? एंड ऑल्सो आई जस्ट आस्क टू क्वेश्चंस टुगेदर। आपने ये भी एक बात की
या
थी पहले कि आपने आपने कहा था कि न्यूट्रल है कोई चीज, या ये किसकी परस्पेक्टिव से लिखी हुई है, राइट?
या
क्या न्यूट्रलिटी ढूंढना कोई एक एक हाई लाइक एक ऐसा ड्रीम होना चाहिए, मतलब लाइक is there something that can actually be called a neutral document of history
हम्म
ever? And
या
is it necessary to run after neutrality, or is it necessary to run after accuracy, or what?
Yeah, I think for the first one, that's a question that a lot of my students often ask me कि अगर तो जिस तरह आप ये पढ़ा रही हैं सारा कुछ, but we studied something very differently, for instance, throughout our schooling about Pakistan's history and whatnot. So how do we know what you're teaching is even accurate, right? And I think the answer that I sort of provide to it is also okay, whenever you're reading a book, for instance, which for me would be the ideal way to study history through a book, for instance, I mean, at the starting of it at least, look at who's writing it. Are they a professional historian? If they are, what do they have claim to? Have they written other books? Which institution are they affiliated with? So look at it. Is it a professional historian, or is it somebody just interested in history? Because that makes a lot of difference. Because if you're a professional historian, there are many different claims and standards that you absolutely have to fulfill. You can't just write any book on history.
Hmm.
I mean, it takes people 10, 20 years to write a book,
Yeah.
because, precisely because you can't just make any claim. So A, who's writing it? Are they a professional historian or not? Secondly, what is the history? What is the history that they're telling? What is the perspective that they're giving? किसके perspective से लिखा जा रहा है? And I mean ये चीजें वो है कि आपको you don't even need to be trained in history कि अच्छा इनके sources हैं कोई कि नहीं है? Who are they citing? What are their sources? What are they saying कि हमने इतना काम किया है which allows us to write about this? हम इन archives पे गए. I know this is a document we came across because most books written by actual historians mention all of that. Um, so who is writing this? Also, what interest do they have in writing this history at the right? Why are they narrating this history, for instance? A lot of the times, I mean, historians would already have an area of specialization, which these would just be extensions of. Who is writing it? Why are they interested in writing this? What are their sources? What is the work that they're detailing they've done that has enabled them to do this? And I think what one has to obviously bear in mind is that what I tell my students to the monopoly of history is the problem, not the multiplicity of historical truths. I don't think there's any historian that has ever claimed that what we're saying is the ultimate truth.
Right.
So, for instance, I mean, Pakistan ki jo creation hai, ispe more than a dozen scholars have written that these were the reasons people were supporting the idea of Pakistan for. A lot of the times when students read those perspectives, they're like, "Acha, which one do we believe?" And I keep telling them that you don't necessarily have to pick either or. You can actually read those perspectives in conversation with one another, and you can join them together to get a bigger picture. कि अच्छा ये ऐसे reasons थे. And a lot of the times, like I, as somebody from the field of history, I believe that there is such a thing as historical truth, but just not that there is only one historical truth. There can be several historical truths that do not contradict one another. So you have to read them in conversation with each other. So no historian ever claims that what we're writing is the ultimate truth. जिसने इसके बाद कुछ कहा या पहले का वो गलत कह रहा है. They're only adding to an already ongoing conversation. They're expanding it, or they're tweaking it, or they're challenging it, but with claims. So किसने ये हिस्ट्री लिखी है, क्यों लिखी है, क्या बता रहे हैं, क्या सोर्सेज हैं इनके, इनका बाकी काम कैसा है? Have they written anything else? What does that look like? And I think neutrality wali baat pe, I don't think, like for me, neutrality is also similar to apolitical, the word, right? I don't think there's anything that we do or that exists that is not political, historically or contemporary times. For me, political, of course, means anything that has to do with values, with ideas, with even imaginations, right? And it has to do with human decisions too. For instance, when I tell my students that climate is a political issue, it's not because climate has to do with one political party. It's because climate change is also being precipitated by human decision making, by particular systems in place, which are also disproportionately, impacting people. So that is political. Similarly, when it comes to I think history writing too, for me, neutrality is, I don't think one should look for that as such. One of my ustads, jinko main kehti hu, Dr. Ali Raza, he used to say, I think it's a quote by this Haitian historian, Jean Casimir. And that quote is that the story of Columbus arriving to the Americas depends on whether you're on the shore or on the ship. If you're on the ship, if you're on the ship, that is a story of a monumental discovery, of adventure, whatnot. But if you're on the shore, that is a story of the destruction of an entire life world. Right? So when you're reading history, what I tell my students in my last session is that see whether that history is being written from the perspective of the ship or the shore. Whose silences are present in that history and why? That is the value we should be looking for. Because, I mean, there are far too many histories that are from the perspective of those in power, of predominant groups. But what about the histories that are actually silenced within those?
Right. And which brings me very magically to one more thing that I wanted to ask you. Okay, हमारे मतलब जो ग्लोबल साउथ के हिस्टोरियंस हैं इस वक्त, एंड आई वुड से maybe especially young historians, like you, इस वक्त हिस्ट्री के दुनिया में मतलब एज अ डिसिप्लिन डीकॉलोनाइजिंग हिस्ट्री की किस तरह की गुफ्तगू चल रही है, इस पर
Hmm.
किस तरह का काम हो रहा है, क्या आप इस तरह के किसी एक्शन ओरिएंटेड काम में इन्वॉल्व हैं, और अगर नहीं भी हैं तो लाइक व्हाट आर द कॉन्वर्सेशंस हैपनिंग, हैव दे इंटेंसिफाइड ओवर द पास्ट डेकेड? बिकॉज आई मीन फॉर एग्जांपल इन डॉक्यूमेंट्री, फॉर एग्जांपल आई थिंक पिछले 20 सालों में, एक्चुअली आई वुड से पिछले 10 सालों में, 10-12 सालों में जितनी ज्यादा डीकॉलोनाइजिंग डॉक्यूमेंट्री पे, डीकॉलोनाइजिंग नॉन फिक्शन पे हमारे डिसिप्लिन में बात हुई है, काम भी हो रहा है, काम कभी अच्छा होता है, कभी बिल्कुल फ्लॉप हो जाता है, कभी जो डीकॉलोनाइज करने जा रहे होते हैं वो खुद कॉलोनाइजर बन जाते हैं, तो यानी देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ सियासत एंड लाइक स्लाइम इन इट एज वेल, बट आई वुड लव टू नो लाइक एक्चुअली लाइक जस्ट लाइक एन अपडेट फ्रॉम द ग्राउंड ऑफ सोर्ट्स के आपकी दुनिया में डीकॉलोनाइजिंग पे क्या क्या काम हो रहा है, किस तरह की बातें हो रही हैं, इज देयर मोर एक्शन, एंगर, work being done recently? What does the space look like at this point?
Decolonization, so I think all of us would know, has been such a catchphrase since quite a long while. And I think, especially in today's moment, it's also being critiqued and very rightfully so.
Hmm.
Because it's sort of just being reduced to a word that
Right.
means nothing at the end of the day.
It's a
Especially when
fashionable word.
already, yeah, right. It's a fashionable word, decolonize this, decolonize that. But what does that really mean?
Hmm.
History, I think the debates that have taken place when it comes to decolonizing the discipline also have to do with acknowledging the roots of history writing as a discipline too. And also the uses of history that have happened in the past to legitimize a lot of projects like colonialism.
Hmm.
When we study, for instance, the British Empire in India, we also have to see that it was not just an enterprise in control and resource extraction, it was also an endeavor in producing knowledge about the natives and writing their histories.
Hmm.
And I think people like Romila Thapar Vagera have written extensively about this. The British periodized India's history in a way that also communally demarcated it. Okay, this is the Muslim past, this is the Hindu past, and that was something that was unfortunately taken over by post-colonial historians in India and Pakistan also. Professor
Hmm.
Dr. Manan has also written about this and whatnot, okay, using particular points as the points of origin for certain communities in India, for instance.
Hmm.
For instance, Muhammad bin Qasim ke arrival ke baad, Islam came to India. Who gave us this narrative and whatnot.
Hmm.
So equalizing wali jo debates and that have to do with acknowledging that history writing has been used in various projects of this sort, including colonialism, including fascism, including theories about inferior civilizations and whatnot. And how do we move past that? Because if the discipline has been used for so long in these endeavors and projects, it is also seeped and steeped in it,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Tools, the way you approach history. What do you even, for instance, say? ये बड़ा colonial refrain होता था कि the natives don't have a history of their own. या इनको तो history writing इनने कभी की नहीं. And that is coming from a place where you're prioritizing, a process of history writing in which there is a set archive,
Hmm.
there is a documentation with dates and whatnot. When a lot of peoples all across the globe have always had a history, but they've documented it in different ways,
Right.
through songs, through art, through whatnot.
And
So if
also
you're a
basic papers, like ऐसा भी नहीं है
yeah,
कि कागज ही नहीं था,
absolutely.
right? मतलब उनके आने से पहले.
वही वाली चीज अगर कागज नहीं है तो इसका मतलब इन्होंने तो हिस्ट्री कभी डॉक्यूमेंट ही नहीं की,
Right.
तो फिर इनकी हिस्ट्री से लिखी जाए. सो इवन एक्सपैंडिंग व्हाट वी सी एज सोर्सेज ऑफ हिस्ट्री, राइट,
Ah.
कि एक लाइब्रेरी, हर सिविलाइजेशन के पास एक लाइब्रेरी नहीं थी जहाँ की चीजें पढ़ी हुई थी. दे
Hmm.
हैड देयर ओन वेज ऑफ डूइंग इट.
Hmm.
So it's acknowledging with the history of the discipline of history itself, how it's been used, and how we have to move past its dominant modes. Okay, for instance, what do we see as history and what do we delegitimize as history? Can folklore be history? I
Hmm.
think there's a book on it called Textures of Time, which was written by, I forget the names of the authors, but they talk about this. For instance, India, mein, there's so many folklores, there's so many mythologies too. Can we classify this as history? Right? We should do that. And in what ways can we do that? I think subaltern studies in some way also had to do with decentering the colonial writing of history
Hmm.
and decentering the voices even of the nation, of the state in narrating history. So
Hmm.
there are lots of efforts of that sort, but I think the more recent debates that I'm also interested in is decolonization, this and that to hota rehta hai.
Hmm.
There are very legitimate barriers also. For instance, I think decolonization also has to happen when it comes to even reading, writing in any discipline.
Hmm.
For instance, conferences.
Hmm.
For people in the global south to even apply to a conference and get a visa for that and whatnot, we know that's not an easy process
Hmm.
if it's not entirely impossible,
Right.
right? So who are you platforming at the end of the day?
Hmm.
Then there are also questions, there are scholars in the West who hire RAs in, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, where not, who do all the grunt work in the field,
Hmm.
but papers और बाकी चीजें वो लिख रहे हैं.
Right.
And there's no acknowledgement for the people, for the actual people from that area doing the work.
Right.
Resource, एक तो exploitation वाली चीज भी इसमें आ जाती है, label भी आ जाती है. Even stuff, for instance, कि when you apply for a PhD to certain universities in the US or UK, there is this thing, foreign students को इससे कम ले नहीं सकते, या आपको
Hmm.
जरा आपको आने में मसला होगा, या funding and all of that. So there is no level playing field as such either,
Hmm.
and I think that must be part of the current conversations happening in the discipline
Hmm.
with regards to these historical power imbalances
Hmm.
that don't just have to do with how you're writing history or how you're doing certain things in a field, but
Hmm.
who even gets to access that field in the first place.
राइट. राइट. और आपके में तो उसकी जो एक, यानी इन एक्शंस की जो हिपोक्रेसी है वो और ज्यादा खुल के बोलती है, बिकॉज आपको प्रोड्यूस ही, मतलब चीजें ऐसी
Yeah,
करनी है जो हिस्ट्री से रिलेटेड हैं, और आप खुद भी
yeah,
अपना प्रेजेंट को फिक्स नहीं कर रहे हैं या इम्प्रूव नहीं कर रहे
yeah.
हैं, तो क्या हिस्ट्री, अगले वाले लोग क्या हिस्ट्री छोड़ के जाएंगे या क्या टेक्स्ट छोड़ के जाएंगे जब पहुंचेंगे ही कमरे में वो, जिनके पास या तो दो पासपोर्ट हैं या कोई एक पावरफुल पासपोर्ट है, या उन पे मुस्लिम बैन नहीं लगा हुआ हो, मतलब हजार तरह की ड्रामेबाजियां तो
बिल्कुल.
दुनिया में चलती रहती हैं, जब चाहे जो है वो, मतलब 9/11 के बाद वीजे कम हो जाते हैं, 7/7 के बाद वीजे कम हो जाते हैं, ट्रम्प के बाद वीजे कम हो, मतलब इतनी सारी चीजें जो है वो होती रहती हैं. अब रहा सा हमारी अपनी इन्फ्लेशन बढ़ गई है, तो वो हमारे अपने मसले भी घर के ठीक नहीं है ज्यादा खुद भी, तो काफी कुछ है. दिस इज रियली इंटरेस्टिंग कि like how people from the global south like should be like platformed, or how they're not being platformed, and also at the same time मुझे कभी कभी ये भी लगता है कि हम, मतलब कॉलोनाइजेशन का आई थिंक कमाल यही है, इफ इट, आई मीन इफ इट वर टू बी प्रेज्ड, उसका कमाल यही है कि उसने हमारे जहन को, मतलब इस तरह से उस पे हुक्मरानी की है अभी तक कि कभी कभी जब हमारा वीजा रिजेक्ट होता है फॉर एग्जांपल, तो हम, मतलब सही है, हमें बुरा भी लगता है, लेकिन हम भी जैसे 2 दिन बाद थोड़ा मूव ऑन सा कर जाते हैं कि हाँ ये तो पहले से शुरू से पता था कि या तो
हाँ,
लगेगा या नहीं लगेगा, राइट. लाइक जिस दिन,
possibility.
हाँ जिस दिन तक पासपोर्ट हाथ में नहीं आता, हम अपने दोस्तों को भी कह रहे होते हैं कि उधर जाना तो है, लेकिन अभी देखते हैं कि जाना होता है या नहीं
हाँ,
होता. ये इवन
हाँ.
जो आप डॉक्यूमेंटेशन की बात कर रही थी अफसा, कि फोकलोर डॉक्यूमेंट हो सकती है, मतलब हिस्ट्री कहा जा सकता है नहीं, सॉन्ग्स को कहा जा सकता है नहीं, लाइक आवर ओन वे ऑफ लुकिंग एट अस इज सो लाइक मेस्ड अप, कि हम ये कितनी बार हमारे अपने घरों के ड्राइंग रूमों में ये बात होती है कि जिस वक्त अंग्रेज अपने मुल्क में यूनिवर्सिटियां बना रहा था तब
हम
मतलब
हम यहाँ ताजमहल बना रहे
ताजमहल
थे.
बना रहे थे. मैं कहा, एक तो ताजमहल बनाना कोई आसान बात नहीं थी. फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल, architecturally it's a masterpiece, सही है.
Yeah.
Secondly, I don't think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, like, I don't think that no लिखाई पढ़ाई, ऐसा तो नहीं है कि लिखाई पढ़ाई नहीं हो रही थी उस वक्त, उस यूनाइटेड,
Exactly.
लाइक उस वक्त के इंडिया में, उस वक्त के साउथ एशिया में, जो भी आप उस रीजन को कहेंगे, मुगल इंडिया
भाई
में.
शायद यूनिवर्सिटियों के फॉर्म में नहीं हो रही थी, बट
हाँ.
ऐसे तो नहीं था कि सारे इलिटरेट अनपढ़ बैठे हुए थे. द
हाँ.
आर्ट्स वर बीइंग प्रमोटेड, कल्चरल एक्टिविटीज वर बीइंग
हाँ.
प्रमोटेड, मकतब वगैरह के जरिए कर रहे होंगे, बट ये
हाँ.
नहीं कि वो मतलब हार्वर्ड यूनिवर्सिटी बनाई थी. इवन
हाँ.
हार्वर्ड्स ओरिजिन आर रिलीजियस.
राइट. ओके.
आई मीन,
हाँ.
ये बहुत, ये असल में मुझे बड़ा इस चीज से मसला होता है कि जो एक ड्राइंग रूम में कॉन्वर्सेशन शुरू हो जाती है ना कि मुगल तो थे ही बुरे बुरे, और यू सो ऑन एंड
पार्टी
सो फोर्थ,
अय्याशी में वो मसरूफ थे.
और इनकी वजह से नूरजहां की औरतों को इन्होंने असल में दे दिया, ये क्या कहते हैं, होल्ड दे दिया, उससे ये एम्पायर कोलैप्स करे. हम लाइक भाई, यू नो व्हाट आर यू सेइंग ऑनेस्टली. मतलब ये क्या है, मतलब I'm not even expecting you to have a training in history, but just think about why is it that we find it so easy to parrot these things.
राइट. राइट. राइट.
Empires have had their ebb and flow since a very long time. The reason that the Mughal Empire eventually went to decline and ended is not because Noor Jahan was given a lot of power. In fact, she was a great administrator. But it's just that,
Okay.
a lot of our history narrations are also so much implicated in existing notions,
Hmm.
including misogyny,
Right.
including
ठीक
sexism.
ठाक. हाँ.
मुझे याद है there was a tour Wall City लाहौर में हो रहा था, night tour. It's a really good tour जो जिसपे
Okay.
the one of the participants was like, हम उधर गए, what do you call it? I keep forgetting it. But he's like, अपनी बीवी के लिए इस शाहजहां ने बनवाया था, और मैं तो यही कहता हूँ कि इनकी बीवियों को जब आप कंट्रोल देते हैं तो यही होता है, फिर एम्पायर एंड होता है. I'm like, yeah, there is no reason for any other decline, but that they
बीवी
love
को
their
पावर
wives.
ज्यादा दी थी शाहजहां ने, जो नूरजहां
Yeah,
का
it's a
मकबरा
lot
है, मैं
about
मैं आप
our
उसकी शायद बात
society.
हाँ.
हाँ, it says a lot about our current society actually than
हाँ.
it does about history. These are the reasons we see for
हाँ.
certain declines and certain,
हाँ.
disgraces in history.
राइट.
But जब ये तो मैंने हर जगह सुन लिया कि वहां वो हार्वर्ड बना रहे थे और यहाँ हम ताजमहल बना रहे
ये
थे.
तो मैं सुन सुन के मेरा दिमाग घूम चुका है अब, और मुझे होता है कि यार लेकिन ये मतलब गालिब अपनी शायरी भी लिख रहे थे और वो आज तक प्रिजर्व भी है, तो क्लियरली ही
क्या?
रोट इट, क्लियरली देयर वाज कागज एंड कलम एंड क्लियरली इट वाज बीइंग रिटन. पर मुझे होता है कि चले भाई ओरल ट्रेडिशन सॉन्ग फोकलोर को ये मतलब बिल्कुल भी मेरा ये ईमान नहीं है कि उसको हम ये कहें कि वो हिस्ट्री नहीं है, बट चले भाई आपको अगर लिखने चीज के लिखे जाने से ऑब्सेशन है कि लिखे हुए कागजात हैं गोरे के पास और हमारे पास नहीं है, तो मतलब just because you haven't seen them or you haven't tried to find them or just because they're being gatekept doesn't mean they don't exist. Doesn't mean people weren't also writing.
Absolutely.
कि बस हाँ, और ये तो कितना कॉमन है कि जब यहाँ पे होती ये मेरे बस समझ में नहीं आता कि जितना कॉमन पूरे मुल्क में हाथी चिऊटी जोक्स हैं विच आई लव, उतना ही कॉमन ये एक बात है पूरे मुल्क में सबको पता है समहाउ कि जब गोरा ऑक्सफोर्ड बना रहा था तब यहाँ
तो
पे
हम ये कह रहे थे.
ताजमहल
और
बनाया.
और ये भी मुझे फनी लगता है कि द सेम पीपल वुड ऑफन आल्सो से कि इस जमाने में हमारी बड़ी ग्लोरी थी, हम बड़े, ये खिता बहुत पीक पे था. बिकॉज आई मीन द ट्रूथ इज वी हैड अ लॉट ऑफ पीपल हु वर एक्सेलिंग इन सो मेनी फील्ड्स in this region. Whether that was the arts, whether that was astronomy, whether that was so many other things.
Right.
So, I mean, वो भी उसी टाइम पे हो रहा था. So, which
हाँ.
statement is true? Yeah,
Right.
there is
Right.
clearly nothing wrong with the statement. You can still build the
हाँ.
Taj Mahal and
हाँ.
promote the arts and education. It's
हाँ.
not either or.
राइट. राइट. राइट.
But
और
we
फिर
find it
हाँ.
easy to digest these simplistic
राइट.
narrations of history, right?
राइट.
अच्छा, that explains.
हाँ, और अगर ताजमहल बनने के बाद, अब पता नहीं, आप तो हिस्टोरियन हैं, आप तो इसको भी फैक्ट चेक कर सकती हैं कि आया कि वर्कर्स के हाथ काटे गए थे या नहीं, लेकिन चलिए अगर काटे गए थे तो दूसरी तरफ बहुत सी यूनिवर्सिटियां भी चोरी शुदा जमीन पे बनी हुई हैं गोरों की. राइट. सो
Yeah.
जुल्म और ऑपरेशन भी हर जगह हुआ है. ऐसा नहीं है कि हम इनहेरेंटली गंदे लोग हैं जिसमें ब्राउन इन
हाँ.
कलर.
But yeah, people actually do have this belief कि गोरे, I've heard this so many times कि यार गोरे सही कहते थे, हम we are not suited for democracy. And there's a quote by Churchill, I believe, I mean the supreme racist of all, that a lot of brown uncles often circulate on WhatsApp, which is if we leave India, they are not fit to rule and पता नहीं क्या, and they unironically share this. And like, do you know the stuff that Churchill was responsible for?
हाँ.
I
हाँ,
mean,
the
he
thing
hated
is that yeah, he
he
hated you,
hated
he
you.
he killed you, he wanted to make you diseased and
He
like sick.
starved you all.
हाँ. हाँ. हाँ.
And it's amazing
हाँ.
the way they parrot it, and then they're like, colonialism ठीक था,
हाँ.
और हमें रेलवेज दे गए, notwithstanding कि रेलवेज उन्होंने अपने दिल की नरमी की वजह से आपको नहीं दिया. It fit in with the colonial project.
Exactly.
And they did not
Exactly.
install the railways everywhere. They
हाँ.
wanted the railways, for governance, for administration, for transporting resources and labor across.
हाँ.
They did not gift it to you.
हाँ.
And we
हाँ.
could have perhaps made the railways without colonialism too. You don't
राइट.
need to build
राइट.
railways.
आपकी नाक के नीचे से आपकी ही चीजें चोरी करके अपने मुल्क में ले जाने के लिए उन्होंने रेलवे सिस्टम बनाया था. कोई मतलब कुछ कमाल नहीं हो
I
गया.
think that's
और
topic उनका वो पर्पस
हाँ,
नहीं
और
था.
आपसे आपके लूटे हुए पैसों से ही बनाई थी, तो ऐसा भी नहीं कि उन्होंने कोई अपना कोई इन्वेस्टमेंट लाए थे वो कि चले मैं थोड़ा सा सीड मनी मैं दूंगा रेलवे मनी रेलवे के लिए. This is fascinating. I really want to know, like, how do you navigate around this very uh, uh, uncomfortable space of drawing rooms and specifically uncles sharing historically inaccurate facts? As a journalist, um, like because I don't always know like history, but like
Yeah.
अगर वो present के historical present के facts inaccurate है तो मुझे तो factual inaccuracy like it's a pet peeve of mine. Like it's actually like
Yeah.
if someone re-narrates a sentence in a different way, मुझे तो होता है कि उसने ये नहीं कहा था, उसने ये बात कही थी, right? So I'm like, I take my quotes very seriously as a journalist. Tell me, tell me, how do you, आपके लिए ड्राइंग रूम में बैठना कैसा होता है, और ये अंकल सी क्यों हिस्ट्री को इनएक्यूरेट तरीके से उसकी बात करते हैं? आंटीज आपको कितनी हिस्ट्री के बारे में बात करती हुई नजर आती हैं, और कितनी इनएक्यूरेट या एक्यूरेट वो होती हैं अपनी बात में?
यार दिस इज, ये तो मेरी एक दुखती रग भी है, आई थिंक. Drawing room conversations, especially, there's so many uncles. The sense that I get is, a lot of brown uncles, especially in Pakistan, see history to be the boys' domain.
Wow.
Much like politics, much like, for instance, conversations about the state, badi badi baatein, is tarah ki. So that they also feel like, they just, it seems like for them, it's like a very old boys club, ki, हमें पता है. हमने हिस्ट्री देखी हुई है, एज इफ आपके अलावा कोई जिंदा ही किसी सन में कुछ था ही नहीं ना, उन्होंने तो एक्सपीरियंस ही नहीं की. एंड दिस इज अ वेरी ओल्ड फिनोमेना आल्सो, बिकॉज आई वाज रीडिंग, नॉट एज ओल्ड, आई मीन पार्टीशन की अगर हम बात कर रहे हैं, इट्स फेयरली रिसेंट हिस्ट्री. One of the things that I learned while researching to teach in my class about partition was that also whenever people like Butalia, Urvashi Butalia, who's written about women's experiences of the partition, when they'd go even to people's houses to ask, अच्छा औरतों का क्या experience था, I want to ask your mother, or I want to ask the woman in your house, they'd be like, इन्हें क्या पता इन्होंने कौन सी शिरकत की थी कोई कांग्रेस की मूवमेंट में या मुस्लिम लीग की मूवमेंट में. देयर इज दिस कंसेप्शन ऑलमोस्ट कि अगर आपने हाई पॉलिटिक्स में जो स्टेट की है और पब्लिक स्फीयर में अगर आपने उसमें शिरकत नहीं की, तो आपने हिस्ट्री में शिरकत नहीं की. As if your experiences are sort of just dislocated from the realm of history because they were in the realm of the home, or they were in the realm of the private, your personhood and whatnot. So it is something that is, it's not something that's new, it's been there. इनको क्या पता हिस्ट्री का, as if they've not experienced it either. But ये drawing room वाले uncles की तो conversations, they're just like, it's easy for them, of course, with all drawing room conversations to make grander statements, right? कि ये हुआ, this is it. इस वजह से बहादुर शाह जफर, ये कर रहा था, what not. I remember, I think a year or so ago, I posted the excerpt from this book. राना सफ़ी की किताब थी जिसके अंदर she laid out कि ईद का जो मेन्यू था मुगल एम्परर का, वो क्या होता था. And it was, I mean, it was just incredible. It was just wonderful. And a lot of people shared it, and some of them were like, this is why the Mughal Empire declined. And I was like, it's not because Bahadur Shah Zafar was having 20 dishes on Eid with his 100 logon ki family. The reasons for the decline of that empire were much more complex. It's very easy for us to draw these linear lines कि ये हुआ तो ये हो गया. But history is much more complex, and that's difficult for people to deal with. Drawing room conversations इसलिए इतनी easily लोग सुन लेते हैं because they give you these sound bites and catchphrases which are just easier to digest, right? ताजमहल बना रहे थे, वो हार्वर्ड बना रहे थे, this is it. But what I've seen is कि there's so many inaccuracies in what they're talking about, and मुझे बहुत होता है कि भाई nuance तो है ही नहीं इसमें, ना complexity है. मैंने क्यों डिग्री की इसमें अगर ये इतना ही इजी था, why did I do this? But the thing is, you also have to be careful in the sense that a lot of these brown uncles, they don't take it lightly if you're questioning what they're saying. And whenever you even try to have a dialogue or conversation, then nahi, I think ये शायद और भी इसके होते, like हमें पता है, या हमने पढ़ा है, और वो ना सोर्स होगा ना साइटेशन होगी, बट हमने पढ़ा है, हमने देखा है. And I think that's a good way for them to just sort of pick themselves out from the conversation, because अगर आप facts पे बात ही नहीं कर रहे, and it's all about your authority and age, then I mean, what can I do in that case? But wherever I see that there is a conversation to be had, I do try to do that. But there's always this thing, also, oh, you're a young woman, तुमने तो कितनी कोई history देखी होगी. As if history सिर्फ देखी जा सकती, पढ़ी नहीं जा सकती. We know, तुम्हें नहीं पता, तुम्हें नहीं पता, ये तो किताबों में बातें होती हैं, all of that. They have all these strategies to, dodge any real question. But it's very difficult because what they talk about in these conversations is also very pervasive otherwise. They parrot the same beliefs that actually a lot of people believe कि अच्छा नहीं, ये reason था, ये था, ऐसे हुआ, अगर ये होता तो ये हो जाता. And that's where I feel like we need to have more public conversations about history too, right? And within that, what I've also seen is there is also a gendered experience, right? If I'm as a young woman talking to a brown uncle, there is this imbalance, right, of age, and also they see you कि तो बच्ची है, इसको क्या पता होगा, इसने क्या ही पढ़ लिया होगा, इसने कितना कोई देखा होगा, इसको क्या याद होगा. So there's also this lack of regard, right, कि somebody actually might be qualified or trained to have this conversation. क्योंकि वो असल में दरअसल the issue is not even about actually contesting or talking about history. It's more about we know, मेरे को आता है, मेरे को सबको आता है, सब कुछ आता है. It's that. So how do you even have a conversation in that regard? But I get you. It's very frustrating because a lot of these drawing room conversations, parrot things are very pervasive otherwise too. WhatsApp पे, drawing rooms में, वैसे लोगों की conversations में बंदा कहाँ कहाँ ये battle fight करे.
इट्स अमेजिंग. अभी हम अंकल्स की जब बात कर रहे थे तो उसमें एक अलग तरह की मिसोजिनी की बात हो रही थी कि दिस इज लाइक मिसोजिनी in somewhat private spaces where you are the skilled person, the others are not, but the others will talk over you because they think they were there. So that is like the only version of history, obviously, that exists. And then obviously because they were there, so like only their version will be talked about, and you don't know um, about, like you can't know it. मतलब देखी जा सकती है हिस्ट्री, बट पढ़ी नहीं जा सकती. I also want to know कि in the classroom space, as a young woman teacher of history, and generally as a woman who teaches history, and as a woman who researches history generally in this discipline, what kind of everyday misogyny incidents or uh, manifestations do you end up just like encountering on a daily basis?
I think within the classroom, that's something that I faced from day one, which is that when you're a young female instructor and you walk in and you're teaching about a subject that is also, conventionally in Pakistan, at least it's seen to be, again, a very male domain. History,
Mm,
politics is what we talk about, or they don't talk about this because इनको क्या ही पता होगा, right?
mm,
One of the first things that I had to immediately set in check was, how I conduct myself.
mm,
For instance, I had to, every single day, I had to police how I'm behaving, what I'm saying. You constantly have to police your authority because one of the first things I got early on was a lot of young boys in classes, the moment they see a young female instructor walk in, they're like, oh, isko kya hi pata hoga, or, let's just, push boundaries with her. Let's constantly try to challenge her authority and challenge her knowledge too.
mm.
you know, to sort of to get that gotcha moment, oh, you actually don't know what you're talking about.
फंसा दिया, हाँ, हाँ.
हाँ, फंसा दिया, ये तो young सी है, इसको क्या ही पता होगा. No need to like be serious about this class. So I've had to, I mean, मेरी growth I think teaching में शायद इसीलिए हुई है because I really had to grow a thicker skin, but also become very assertive in class.
Mm, mm, mm,
Which was not to say that, there have been moments in class where I feel like I've learned a lot from my own students. So there is always this place of humility that I
of
hold
course.
close to myself. But I've also realized there is a balance that needs to be struck between that place of humility, but also in asserting your authority and, and basically also maintaining the respect that you are entitled to.
Mm.
Which is not that old school respect जो जैसे हमारे society में होती है कि कोई बड़ा है तो उसको question भी ना करो, all that.
Disagree भी नहीं कर
But
सकते,
this,
question
yeah,
भी नहीं. हाँ.
disciplinary basis.
Mm,
Lots of boys, for instance, would cut me off in the middle, would not let me finish my sentence. And I think I had to learn how to say, you know what, let me finish. I'm not
mm,
done speaking yet. Which, as
mm.
you know, as women, that's it's something to be able to reach that point to say, no,
Yeah.
I have my space, let me say my piece, and then you can go on.
Mm,
They would cut you in between, and there's constantly, nitpicking things. कि अच्छा, but you were talking about this, so असल मामला तो ये है. There's always all these, there's a particular category of a boy, I think in classes, which is this devil's advocate, debater boy, who's
yeah.
constantly trying to be nitpicky and be like, but just to be the devil's advocate. And you know where that is coming from. Like I've been very patient when it comes to students who are genuinely trying to unlearn and they're
Mm.
struggling, कि हमें तो
ठीक है.
पूरी जिंदगी ये किया है.
हाँ.
I have a lot of respect for those students too,
Right.
because I know that they're coming from a place of good faith.
Yeah,
They're
and they're
genuinely,
18, like they're 18-year-olds, right?
yeah,
They're
they're,
babies.
they're young. They have studied something their entire life that is not, now I'm telling them, we need to question it a little bit.
Huh.
So I can see that they're struggling, and kabhi, they say stuff which, might be problematic, but I know that they're
Right.
coming from a place of good faith. They're
Absolutely.
trying.
Yeah.
But then it's also very easy to see people who are not coming from a place of good faith, who are genuinely, they're actually disingenuous.
Hmm.
They're just trying to sort of catch you off guard,
Hmm.
question your knowledge, just to show, isko kya hi aata hai, all of that. And that
Hmm.
has been exhausting for me as a young female
Ah,
instructor.
yeah.
Just trying to, and what really I think makes me bitter is that a male instructor at my age, at my position, would not have to worry
No.
about these things.
No.
He
No.
can go around joking in class and yet be respected.
Yeah.
But for me, that's a choice.
Yeah.
Either I can be all funny or I can be respected.
Right.
And that's a hard task, right?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So
And
it
it's
gives
like
me a
an
resentful.
Yeah, and it's like it's an unfair ask. Like, I mean, in an ideal world, you shouldn't have to curate your personality according to how it should be in the eyes of others. It should be who you are. If
Yeah.
you're a funny person, you can be a funny teacher as well while teaching serious stuff, right? But if you have to curb it down just because okay, आपको किस तरह से लिया जाएगा, then yeah. And this is, I mean, these are like, and and again, like these are like expensive private institutions, right?
Yeah.
इसमें कोई वो वाला स्टीरियोटाइप हम नहीं घटिया हरकत कर सकते स्टीरियोटाइप करके कि ये जी कोई बच्चे हैं जिनको कुछ नहीं पता कि कैसे कंडक्ट
हाँ.
करना है अपने आप को. ये आप इसी तरह अमीरों की स्पेसेस से उठ के अमीरों की ही जगह पे आए हैं. ये कोई इट्स नॉट अ सोशल क्लास इशू, इट्स नॉट अ
Yeah.
इंग्लिश उर्दू पंजाबी इशू, इट्स नॉट अ
It's
लाइक यू.
simply
हाँ.
a gendered issue.
या
It's
या
simply seeing a young woman walk in and your impulse being, you know what, I refuse to take her seriously, and I will prove I
एग्जैक्टली.
am taking her less seriously by questioning her authority,
हाँ.
by not giving her the respect that she is entitled to, by
Hmm.
trying to, question her knowledge also, you don't know what you're talking about.
Do you think most of these boys know what they're doing?
100%.
Okay.
100%. Like there's only so much benefit of doubt I can give to certain kids. ठीक है यार, they're trying, they learn during undergrad, this is a formative time. But I think as instructors, it's a lot of students don't realize it's very easy for us to see through the type of student that they are.
Yeah. Is there a reading list or a watching list related to history, South Asian history, Pakistani history that you would recommend to us?
I think my list will be more Pakistan specific, given that my
Awesome.
area of specialization is in Pakistan. But
Great.
one of the books that I initially recommend is The Murder of History by K.K. Aziz.
Okay.
And I think anybody can pick up that book because most of us have had a schooling life where we have consumed certain predominant narratives about Pakistan. And those are the narratives that this book unpacks with a lot of substantiation and whatnot. So I think The Murder of History by K.K. Aziz, The Struggle for Pakistan by Aisha Jalal. Aisha Jalal's journal articles, I find them harder to read perhaps. But I think this book, it's a good rundown of what's happened in Pakistan's history. Why are we at the point that we're at? Uske alawa, I mean, of course, there are more specific ones like The State of Islam, Culture and Cold War Politics by Sadia Toor. There's, Knowledge and Identity by Ruweena Sehgal, who's also talking about, history में पाकिस्तान में ऐसी बातें क्यों की जाती हैं, क्या की जाती हैं, what do they cover up, what do they not. There are other books like, for instance, The Idea of Pakistan by Stephen Cohen, Political Conflict in Pakistan by Mohammad Wasim. And Ian Talbot, I think, has written 3 books, which is just an overview of Pakistan's history. He's written plenty on Pakistan, so I think it's a good starter also.
This was so helpful and so wonderful. It was so amazing to listen to you, Hafsa, and to listen to all of um, your thoughts. And so it was fun to agree with you on a lot of things also. But thank you so much for taking out so much time. Sunday की सुबह बात कर रहे हैं. So special big thanks for doing that and having the patience for that. And yeah, like hopefully we'll meet. But thank you so much for just taking out the time for this conversation. I'm sure it's going to help like anyone who listens to it in many ways.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think this was a great start to my Sunday, and it's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. Thank you.